Hello, welcome to night 2 of the Mainstage at Thin Air 2014. So glad to see you all here tonight. My name is Charlene Deal, and I'm the director of the festival, and I'm so glad you could join us this evening for Women on the Front Lines. We are about to hear a lineup of most extraordinary women writers writing about the lives of ordinary and extraordinary women. And you'll find these stories are often poignant, always powerful, and very, very authentic. The first writer tonight is a prolific writer who is kind of the most ambidextrous of writers because she writes for kids, she writes for teens, and she writes for adults. And I think this year she might have like 4 new titles or something like that. It's just insane. And every single one of them is powerful and compelling. Her name is Carolyn Adderson, and she comes to us from the far edge of BC. Please welcome Carolyn Adderson.
Thanks so much. I'd like to thank Charlene for inviting me back to this festival and for inviting Ellen from Ellen and Pieces and to the staff and volunteers of Thin Air that make this really just such a fabulous festival. So there were so many front lines in Ellen McGilty's life that I had trouble deciding what to read. She's a single, divorced publicist trying to see her daughters into adulthood, trying to recover from a broken marriage, trying to get help for her ailing, estranged father, trying in the end to deal with her own health crisis. So I thought I'd just start at the beginning with the chapter called I Feel Lousy. And in this chapter, Ellen's youngest daughter, who's in her first year of pre-med, is pregnant by a boy she barely knows. And while Ellen waits to decide for Yolanda to decide what she's going to do, she's assailed by memories of when she herself was in a similar predicament just 10 years earlier. The only other thing you need to know is that lice was a big problem at her daughter's school. A decade ago, when Larry and Ellen had already been apart, separated, and then divorced for 7 years, Larry phoned. Normally, Ellen called him. She called so that his daughters could have contact with their father. She would pass the receiver over to them or suggest he invite them down to LA. Even though Ellen felt humiliated when Mrs. Silver II answered, she called. Estranged from her own family and suffering because of it, she swallowed hard and dialed. She dialed for the sake of her girls. Now Larry phoned out of the blue and asked to come back. His marriage to Amy was over. Some new woman he'd been besotted with had dumped him at the same time the television series he wrote for was canceled. Raw with these failures, Larry wanted to be with his children. And Ellen allowed it. Watching him get out of the cab a few days later, seeing his overgrown black curls, his wrinkled chinos and sad, pouched eyes, the way he set down his suitcases and checked every pocket of his pants and jacket to come up with the fare, drawing out a wadded bill here, a bit of change there, she immediately forgave him. Forgave and swelled with a physical ache to have him inside her body and life again. And Larry forgave Ellen, though he had much less to forgive. Ellen thought they were happy during those two crazy hippie years on Cordova Island, living off the grid. Larry had seemed happy the 9 months he lived with them in North Vancouver. They had great sex. He and the girls formed an instant mutual adoration society. He even made their lunches better lunches than Ellen's, cheese melts with raisin faces, Rice Krispie squares that weren't square but stamped out with cookie cutters. Before Larry's return, the girls used to walk themselves to school. Ellen was working, the only mother who didn't escort her kids, and for her negligence, she received a wide range of disapproving looks, from askance all the way to deploring. But now Mimi and Yo had a father to walk them and pick them up. In between, Larry fixed up the house and wrote his play and pulled the phone out of Ellen's working hand and fucked her in the afternoon. He stood at the stove stirring Rice Krispies into the marshmallow goop, muttering snatches of dialogue. He'd written plays before getting sucked into television. Ellen told him he didn't need the money anymore. Ellen Silver Promotions was thriving by then, so he could be true to his art again. "You make me puke," she told him when he announced he was going back. To Amy? To L.A. Within 24 hours, he was packed and out of their lives. At the time, Ellen had been hired to promote an American novelist on the Vancouver leg of his West Coast book tour. She got the girls up, dumped their cereal in and around their bowls. "When's Daddy coming back?" they asked. Again. They couldn't understand his inconstancy. Mimi was too young the first time to remember he'd abandoned her once before. Yolanda had been unborn. Ellen lost it. "Daddy isn't coming back. Daddy's never coming back. Daddy used up all his chances." That went over well. It was one of the few mornings she walked them to school. Well, she dragged them sobbing, Ellen in tears herself, saying, I'm sorry, but I have to be downtown in 20 minutes. Believe me, I would like nothing better than to stay home with you and cry." She met the American novelist in the restaurant of the Hyatt to review his schedule. Interviews, bookstore signings, and then the grand finale, the reading. He asked straight out, "Did you love my book?" "I did," Ellen said. She'd only read the beginning and the end and some of the middle bits. "It's brilliant." It was middling, actually, but you don't feed two children on honesty. "Before I forget," she slid her business card across the table to him. "Anytime you need to, call." He looked at it. ESP? Cute. Ellen sighed. Silver isn't even my name anymore. I'm back to McGinty. I'm divorced. How it seared, that admission. Why had she told him? She looked down at the coffee spoon on her saucer and contemplated gouging out her eyes with it. "I'm not crying," she would tell the surprised novelist. "I'm not. It's just that when you blind yourself, your eyes water." And so the American novelist's reply didn't register at first. Ellen was on autopilot, not only contemplating self-harm, but miserable for having shouted at the girls that morning. All through the meeting, she kept picturing herself hauling them, wailing and unbrushed, into the school. What he'd said was, "Good." Now she looked up and really saw him, the antithesis of Larry. Tall, even when seated, also full of himself, though that was more a point of commonality. He would have been gorgeous, but for the blonde hair ebbing off the promontory of his forehead. But who was Ellen to be critical? Parts of her were too prominent. Fortunately, she was sitting on two of them. "Do you have ESP?" the novelist asked. The business was done, his breakfast consumed, their coffee cups thrice refilled. Ellen relaxed. "Let me see." She closed her eyes and touched her temples. Under the table, the novelist placed his foot over hers, implying not pressure, but closeness. A shudder ran through her, half thrill, half warning. She felt very slightly ill. "The bill will come," she intoned, "and you will offer to pay it. But I will insist, and you will succumb." Succumb? The waiter appeared. Just before she closed her eyes, Ellen had noticed him in her peripheral vision making his way across the room. The novelist threw back his head and let go a weird, high-pitched laugh, almost a seal's bark. "I'll get it," he said, before the waiter even opened his mouth. "I insist," Ellen said, reaching for her purse. The The novelist laid the back of his hand across his Gibraltar forehead, behind which all his novels were plotted, his conquests too, no doubt. Oh, I succumb. Had his publicist in San Francisco succumbed in Seattle at 11:30 in the morning? She shouldn't do it. Why did she always do it? To spite Larry? He wouldn't care. To prove to herself she could collect lovers too? That she was still desirable even though Larry didn't want her? Or just to keep opening her wound? She felt so wretched afterward. She always felt so lousy. We could go upstairs, but I warn you, I'll want to hear more about my book. I could read it out loud, Ellen said, while I do delicious things to you. The waiter, who had vanished with her credit card, returned with it on a tray just in time to hear the novelist in mid-seduction. He stepped quickly away. Ellen blushed, leaning over the bill, dizzy with embarrassment and desire. Desire could be so wonderfully distracting. Her desolation was lifting, even as she calculated the tip. 15% plus 5 for discretion. Click. Something dropped onto the bill, right onto the blank line she was staring at, a crumb or a speck of dirt. She hoped. Not alive, not a living thing. Yes, it definitely moved. It was probably on its back, kicking its imperceptible legs in the invisible air. You needed the magnifying glass that came in the knit kit to actually see their legs. In an instant, her whole scalp was crawling. She glanced at the novelist to see if he'd noticed. No, he was signing her copy of his book. Ellen swept the tray onto the restaurant floor, oopsed, and picked it up. Excuse me, I'll be right back. She barely reached the bathroom in time. Vomited, rinsed her mouth in the sink, scratched her whole head hard enough to draw blood. With the comb, she made herself presentable again. Back at the table, she told him, "Sorry, suddenly I'm not feeling so hot." On her way home, she stopped at the drugstore for delousing shampoo and a pregnancy test. Now she lay in the tub in the middle of the day, suds dripping down her shoulders, over her breasts. It took 10 minutes to kill the lice. Then you had to comb out the corpses and the eggs. Deep inside her, a factory was churning out cells. Of course, she would have to have it, the assembled product, a sister or a brother to her girls, a living thing. Thank you.
My next guest is Monia Mazik, who comes to us from Ottawa. Monia became a name that many of us recognized several years back when she wrote a book called Hope and Despair about her husband, Mayor Arar. She's a novelist in her own right, and she writes in French, and her books are translated in English. She'll actually be presenting Hope and Despair at Big Ideas on Thursday, but tonight she's reading to us from a novel called Mirrors and Mirages. Please welcome Monia Mazik.
Good evening. So happy to be in Winnipeg. Last time I was here, I was telling some of the authors who asked me if I ever came to Winnipeg. And yes, I was here before in 2007. I was living in Kamloops, British Columbia. I was a professor there. And then we decided to go back to Ottawa. And then we did crazy thing. We took our car and we crossed Canada from there to Ottawa, and Winnipeg was one of the places I came to and we visited. So I'm so excited to be back again here, but I can see also it changed so much since in 7 years, so I'll look forward visiting again. Thank you very much for the Thin Air Festival to invite me Thank you, Charlene, for introducing me, and for all the volunteers, everyone who made my trip possible, and thank you for coming this evening. The book I'm going to read from this evening is Mirrors and Mirages. It is a book about 4 women. Actually, there are more than 4, but 4 main characters. And all of them are women, and they share something in common. They are Muslim, and they happen to live also in Canada. But especially these days, we hear a lot about Islam, a lot about Muslim women, but we don't hear their voices. We don't hear the one who are concerned. And with this book, I don't want to pretend to give you a full spectrum of all the women, but I just wanted the readers to have a small peek on the lives of some Muslim women. So the first one, this first woman her name is, it's interesting, her name is Sally. So her name seems so Canadian, at least like Western. But she is Muslim. She was born in Canada. Her parents are from Pakistan. Her father is a taxi driver. And her parents always wanted her to become the engineer that her father was not able to be in Canada. And she grew up, no problem, only daughter in the family. And then all of a sudden, she discovered her religion. And she became so, what we call today, radical, or she became a different person that even her mother, who is Muslim, and her father could not recognize. So let me read you a little bit about her. Ever since she found the true path, Sally's life had not been the same. She performed her prayers meticulously. She covered her body from head to toe so that not even the slightest hair showed. She covered her face except her eyes and wore black gloves. But her radical transformation had not kept her away from her computer and from the internet. She was continually online, reading up on Islam and practicing in the multiple and participating in the multiple forums she found there. In fact, it was when she discovered those forums that Sally had begun to take an interest in her religion. Up until then, religion had been an accessory for her, something that made her feel good about herself, a kind of a talisman that helped her to get what she wanted from her parents, to display the model daughter label. Now, all of that was behind her. At 21, she was brimming with her self-assurance. She didn't need fetishes to succeed in life. She wanted nothing to do with traditional Islam, of the kind her parents practiced. She wanted a pure, unadulterated Islam, an Islam that would make her feel strong and superior. And the only way to do that was to return to the source, to learn the truth about everything. So it was that the internet became Sally's savior, the light in her darkness, the only avenue to the only reliable sources, those of true Islam. For every question that arose, she simply consulted the collection of ready-made fatwas available on the internet. Should she pray while wearing makeup? Should she show her face and hands in public? Or should she wear gloves? Should she speak on the telephone in her normal voice? Or should she place her hand over her mouth when speaking to strange men? Wasn't it forbidden to speak to strangers? And wasn't the female voice seductive? You could find everything you wanted on the internet, but you have to make sure to visit the right sites, those that promise pure Islam, not those
others that claimed to be Muslim but were really agents of corruption that confused young people even more. Sally's parents, Mrs. and Mrs. Hussein, no longer knew how to deal with their only daughter. The earthquake that had destroyed their peaceful family life had caught them unawares. At first, they were pleased when their daughter sat down in front of the computer to study and to consult websites. It all seemed normal to them. Sally was an excellent student who had never caused to them the slightest concern. Sally's mother kept the sewing fashionable dresses for her, made for the best fabrics to suit the season. But as time passed, Sally began to turn her back on the clothing her mother made for her. At first, Fauzia thought her daughter didn't like her creations, that she preferred clothing off the rack. It was Sally's age, she reasoned. She's still young and trying to affirm her personality, she concluded, and with her customary simplicity, she let things ride. But Sally only wanted to wear the jilbab. At first, she didn't cover her hair, leaving it tied up in a bun and at the back of her head. She spoke to her parents less and less. She didn't tell them that what she read on the internet was making her more certain day by day that she must reject their impious lifestyle and draw closer to God. Gradually, she felt resentment toward them creeping into her mind. Why do they live like infidels? Why don't my mother hide her hair in front of strangers? She didn't hate them, but she had begun to call her entire life into question, and with its principles, her parents had handed her down to her. So that's Sally, and I'm going to tell you about another character in the book. Her name is Samia, and she's another Muslim woman here in Canada, and she came as what we call an immigrant investor. So her husband is wealthy, and she spent most of her time at partying and having a hard time with her teenage daughter. Nancy Ajram's voice filled the hall. Dearest, come close, feast your eyes on me. The top Arab pop star warbled as a crowd of girls and women indulged in the middle of the dance floor. This was not merely belly dancing, but entire bodies moving every which way, back and forth, whirling, bobbing, and weaving. The younger girl lifted up their hair with both hands. With languorous eyes, they swung their hips with consummate skill. They shook their shoulders, thrusting forward the daring cleavage of their evening gowns. Their elders, thick of thigh and round of belly, tempered by age and many pregnancies, danced modestly, letting their hands follow the rhythm of the song. As if on cue, a tight circle formed around Samia. The sequined dress that barely reached her knees looked as if it were painted on her body. She was small, svelte, round after round of dieting and long session at the slimming center had kept her relatively fit, at least in the eyes of most of the ladies who knew her. She danced at the center of the group like a squirming earthworm surrounded by hungry beetles. Her limber body swayed from left to right as her eyes, caked with kohl and mascara, darted furtively in all directions. The other women's gazes dripped jealousy, but their forced smile, that outburst of laughter, their clapping, and their flattering banter created a joyous, animated atmosphere. Samia kept on spinning and thrusting her shoulders forward. It was as if she had been transported back in time to Kuwait 20 years ago. She was studying English then, and she would dance with her girlfriends and dream of a Prince Charming who would carry her away to a wonderful life, far beyond the surrounding desert and the social suffocation of everyday existence. Her choice of English was the first step in drawing closer to the West. She was determined to acquire the tools that would help her break free from this land that was killing her softly day by day. The only thing that gave her the illusion of freedom was the monthly get-together at the home of one of her girlfriends. She and her friends would dance, put on extravagant makeup, smoke a few cigarettes, and then sit down to watch an Egyptian tearjerker. For all her escapades, Samia considered herself a good Muslim. She wore a headscarf and prayed, though not always, regularly. There were days where she felt too tired or felt her faith a bit weak. Deep down, she knew that those things were only extravagances and that she was a good girl at heart. When she finally found a husband, things would be different. Finding the husband had become her obsession. Her parents wanted her to marry a Palestinian, as her cousins had done. But Samia dreamed of a Lebanese man, an Arab Don Juan who would whisper in her ear with a cultivated accent, who would cover her with diamonds, who would make her laugh. In a word, someone who would bring her happiness. She wanted a well-mannered man, handsome, wealthy, and of a good family. Unfortunately, among all the sons of the Palestinian families they knew, there were no such person. They were ugly, too dark, too skinny, too fat, too serious, too religious, son of families that were not as well off as she would like. And then finally, I will introduce Louise. Louise is the daughter of Alice, a lady from Quebec. And then she became Muslim. And then, of course, that created a huge despair and a huge fraction in the family. Louise looked downright ridiculous in the new prayer outfit she would bought at the Arab convenience store down the street, the one that sold halal meat and Middle Eastern spices but had recently begun to sell headscarves imported from Turkey and inexpensive prayer garment from the United Arab Emirates. It consisted of a long skirt with an elasticized waistband that came down to her ankles and a large scarf with a hole in the middle that fitted over the face, while the rest of the fabric covered her shoulders, arms, and midsection. She was standing in the living room on the tiny silk carpet her mother had bought last year to bring herself some pleasure after all the years of hard work, as she never tired of repeating. Louise knelt, forehead touching the floor, then got to her feet and bent over, her hand resting on her knees, then put her forehead to the floor once more, her mouth silently forming the words of the prayer. Her mother's sudden entry in the room released a bolt of tension. Pretending to be engrossed, Louise kept praying, but for all her efforts, her head began to spin. Alice Gendron, lost in her memories and breathing heavily after climbing the stairs, began to seethe with anger at the sight of her daughter, dressed like a beggar, her eyes lowered in concentration, toes aligned and on the handsome Persian carpet she had worked so hard to buy. She wanted to explode in fury, to vomit up the words that seemed trapped in her throat, to free herself of the stress that had been building over the past weeks. She wanted to make a scene, to show Louise how much she was suffering deep down and how betrayed she felt. But she swallowed her hurt and rushed off to the refuge of her bedroom. It was strange. She simply did not have the strength to force a confrontation. Louise no longer knew what she was saying as she mechanically recited the words she had memorized from the little book her friend Amr had lent her. Her mother's unexpected appearance had had the effect of a volcanic eruption. Everything turned upside down in her mind. She didn't know whether to keep praying or to stop. The words of the prayer that she had repeated so often and learned so well were swept away as by a desert wind. Thank you.
Our third reader in the first half is Joan Thomas, who is justly famous in this city as she's one of my favorite writers, and I was very delighted to know that she had a new novel out. So she's going to read to us tonight from The Opening Sky. Please welcome Joan Thomas.
Well, I'm so extremely excited to be here in this lineup of rock stars, and very happy to be launching this novel. It's been 4.5 years, and it's a Winnipeg book, and the characters and the story have just been, filling up my head for the last 4 years, and I'm so thrilled to finally be able to talk about them and to read from this book. And actually, my formal launch is not till October 7th. So this feels a little bit like sort of a secret launch, and there's bootleg copies over there, whatever. But anyway, I'm very thrilled to be presenting this book here. And the theme of the night is lives of girls and women. And so I sort of thought I would send this reading out to our Prime Minister, the Right Honorable Stephen J. Harper, who is at the UN this week promoting his program for child and maternal health, which is very fitting maybe on one level, except of course that this is Climate Week. And given the deficiencies with his program in the first place, it just seems to have compounded the irony that he is ignoring Climate Week and sort of indifferent or oblivious to all of the ways in which his efforts will be dwarfed by the crisis that we're facing. So I feel like, thrusting Naomi Klein's book into his face, this changes everything. In my novel, The Opening Sky, most of the characters get it. They're a little bit further advanced than our politicians. Sylvie's boyfriend, Noah, is so concerned about overpopulation that in the absolute way of young people, he signed an internet pledge that he'll never have children. It's called the Voluntary Human Extinction Movement. It's a real website. You can go to it if you want. It's a little bit late for some of us, but of course, these sorts of answers are not straightforward, and as they discover dramatically when Sylvie finds out that she's pregnant and rather far along, in spite of their best efforts. Sylvie gives herself a day off from classes and spends most of it in bed. She's not sick, but she has some strange physical symptoms, including a metallic taste in her mouth. When the building falls quiet, she falls back to sleep. Around noon, she wakes up and fishes Kajri's Human Physiology text out of the bed. It's got a long chapter on the development of the Homo sapiens fetus, full of fiber optic photos of babies in the womb. Through the fall, unaware, Sylvie harbored a tadpole, a fish, and a lizard. But now her baby is a mammal. It has lost its tail. It's covered with hair. It has an alien's face with raspberry-colored veins twining over its bulging forehead. It's already equipped for the evolutionary task of populating the planet. Those little olive-shaped ovaries have 50,000 eggs in them. Sylvie can take this only in small doses. She drops the book to the floor, gets up, and eats 2 things of raspberry yogurt and a Morning Glory muffin from the windowsill. Noah had to go back to Guelph before the ultrasound. Well, he could have stayed, but his mother had paid for his airline ticket, and he didn't yet have Sylvie's insight into what a total waste of time the first week of the semester is. So in the end, it's her parents who walk with her down the long hall of the hospital and sit with her for an hour while she pretends to be absorbed in a People magazine so they'll leave her alone. And Noah misses it all. He misses a big lesson in the secret, inside strangeness of things. Afterwards, Sylvie's parents wait by Liz's car in the parking lot while Sylvie stands in the litter of butts at the hospital entrance and calls him. He picks up on the second ring. It's a girl, she says. Though really, this is the unnerving thing. It's a baby. An actual baby, lying gray and remote and unconscious of being spied on. That's great, Noah says. His voice sounds weird and phony, and so does hers. In the car, she sits in the back seat and watches the narrow houses of Maryland Street slide by. Her parents were quiet in the ultrasound room, but now they talk on and on about how amazing the picture quality was. When Liz was pregnant with her, they say, ultrasound technology was much cruder. Every once in a while, you got a flash of a limb or an organ, but the image was so gibbled, you started having nightmares that your baby was maybe in pieces. whereas this baby is evidently intact, as the technician confirmed by her bored manner. Sylvie tapes the image over her bed at the dorm. It's hard to put it up where everyone can see it, but she knows it's part of getting used to the idea. It looks like a big-headed doll seen through windshield wipers on a dark night in a heavy rain. Late in the afternoon, Sylvie's friends from the fringe troupe come to her room bearing various drinks based on soy milk, cow's milk, yogurt, and ice cream. First pick for Sylvie, Thea says. I'll take the banana smoothie, Sylvie says. I'm starving. One banana smoothie, Thea says, handing it over, for the miracle mama. Somebody, maybe Sylvie herself, told them about the 0.3% failure rate of the pill, and they're turning her pregnancy into some sort of victory of nature over pharmacology. They spy the ultrasound picture. While they're all still raving about it, Benedictor comes to the door to wish Sylvie a Happy New Year. He's never been to her room before. I wanted to see if you got your botany paper finished, he says. He makes a sad face, as though the loss of her brilliant paper was his fault. Her friends draw him over to see the ultrasound. Meet the 7 billionth human baby, Thea announces. That's over, says Jenna. Isn't that over? Benedictor stares at the image and then looks at Sylvie in confusion and surprise. She has so enjoyed his fascination with her. She's so used to sipping it like a hummingbird and then darting away that she feels embarrassed as she smiles to say, yes, it's true. He comes over and squeezes her hand and says courteously, I congratulate you. Kashri passes around a Tupperware container of veggie samosas from her auntie in Windsor Park, just delivered. Once they've all settled into eating, Sylvie grabs the moment of distraction from her ultrasound to ask, where are we at with the play? You guys met without me, didn't you, last week? You knew we were meeting. I know, I'm not mad. I'm just asking. Well, they did meet. They've dropped the Maldives. They spent the whole meeting talking about the news from the UN Climate Summit. Then they were so depressed that they walked up the skating trail as far as the Norwood Bridge, where they found 2 old packing crates buried in the snow on the bank, dragged them out onto the ice, and built a symbolic fire to say goodbye to the human race. Oh, come on, Sylvie says. They drink their smoothies and munch on their samosas. She gets the impression no one wants to meet her eyes. We have no ideas, Kashri says finally. It's too big. It's too scary. No one wants to hear about it. Well, let's do something smaller then, Sylvie says. Like, who was that environmentalist who walked into the oil and gas auction in the States and bought up a whole bunch of wilderness leases and ended up in jail? Maybe we could tell his story. Tim DeChristopher, Nathan says. He's out now. He's turned religious. Or, Sylvie says, maybe there's some sort of allegory we could do, like, I don't know, that play we read in grade 10, Arthur Miller and the Salem Witches. Or let's do something futuristic, says Thea. When we really get into a global burn and can't grow food anymore and everyone is starving, scare the shit out of people. Benedictor is leaning against the closet door. Ask people in the Horn of Africa if that is the future, he says. They sit and stand in silence, well rebuked. Benedictor, you have to join us, Sylvie says. You totally have to. She's leaning against her desk beside Nathan. His sleeve is rolled up. He's got a fresh tattoo along the inside of his left arm. She picks up his arm, feeling an upswell of tenderness. He's one of her oldest friends, so full of need, so gentle and delicate, as though it's hard for him to be exposed to the elements. He makes her think of a trembling whippet. She bends her head close to the wound. The tattoo is text, a plain font, but it's tiny and hard to make out because his skin is still swollen. 4 words, no water, no moon. What does it mean, she asks with her eyes, and she feels his gratefulness flicker up like a little flame. He takes his arm back and taps on his smartphone. In this way and that, I tried to save the old pail since the bamboo strip was weakening and about to break, until at last the bottom fell out. No more water in the pail, no more moon in the water. She passes back his phone, and they look at each other in understanding. Sylvie finishes her samosa and presses some crumbs off the desk with her fingertips. She turns back to her friends, looking from one anxious face to another. You know what I think about, she says finally? The hot summer nights when this show will be running. It'll be about 30 degrees out. All the venues have air conditioning now, says Emily. When she's nervous, she has a deeply annoying way of talking with her eyelids fluttering. That's right, they do. And our audience lives out in Fort Richmond or Charleswood, and they'll start their SUVs, which also have air conditioning, of course, and drive across the city, and then they'll walk into our cool, comfortable theater, and we'll hand them a program printed on paper made from clear-cut logging operations, and they'll drop it on the floor a minute later. It'll be dark outside, but our stage will be blazing with light. Another long silence. Nobody looks at Sylvie. She picks up her smoothie from the desk and takes a long drink, sucking air with a rude slurp. Emily knows a guy who will rent us a sound system powered by a stationary bicycle, Kajri says. Don't you, Emily? Emily herself doesn't say anything. She turns a look that could kill on Sylvie. I am so done with this, thinks Sylvie. Thank you.
Alison Pick comes to us from Toronto, and her new book is called Between Gods. Please welcome Alison Pick.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah, it sounds different from this side of the microphone. When my last book, Fartigo, came out, I had an experience reading in Toronto. I asked the audience, could they hear me? And they said no, and the sound guy came up and did his adjusting. And I asked, could they hear me now? And they said still no, and he came up and did his adjusting. And this went back and forth maybe 4 or 5 times, and we got it all settled. And then I put my papers down on the podium, and the podium fell over. That's right. It's a nice, sturdy podium here. So thank you so much for coming and for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. One of the benefits about being at literary festivals is you get to share the stage with other writers who you respect and admire. And this group of women, for me, is really an exceptional group in that regard. They've taught me about friendship, about literary camaraderie, how to be a good literary judge, how to be a good writing teacher, and also, most importantly, what it is to write exceptionally well. So I'm really grateful to share the stage with all of them. And it's really lovely to be back in Winnipeg. I think that this was the first literary festival I ever attended in 2003 when Question and Answer came out. I have this sort of memory of showing up at the airport and having no idea what I was getting involved in. I think I had a really big backpack, like the kind that you would take on a big hiking trip. I had my tent in there. That was my first festival too. Was it? Anyway, it's really lovely to be back. So I'm going to read from my new memoir, Between Gods. I was in my early 20s when I had my first stint of psychotherapy. It took place on the top floor of a private home on a leafy suburban street in my university town. To get to the office, I had to climb a staircase. There was nothing special about the staircase. It wasn't hidden behind a false wall, say, or carpeted with psychedelic paisleys. But climbing it gave me a shiver, part dread, part anticipation, as if I were progressing up and into a different world entirely. I had originally called to book an appointment with a woman named Karen. Karen had star power. She had written a bestseller about hugging. Because of this, or perhaps because of her genuinely remarkable skills, she was in demand. She got back to me saying she was booked solid, but her husband, Ben, had some openings. I agreed reluctantly. Mere months ago, I had been a girl with many friends, a high achiever. Now I found myself dressed in chunky Guatemalan sweaters, 20 pounds heavier than when I'd started university the previous year, my body blindly mimicking the weight I felt inside. I would wake in the night with my heart pounding. In the morning, I'd rally my resources to face the cereal bowl. I'd tried, without luck, to will myself back into wellness, to apply myself, but nothing had worked. Therapy was my last resort. On the day of my first session, I climbed those stairs slowly, and Ben was there to greet me at the top. His wife may have been a rock star, but Ben was a soft-spoken septuagenarian in corduroys. He reached out and took my hand. "Welcome," he said. I detected, I thought, a slight Californian accent. He led me into his office where there was a chair and a small couch. I watched to see which place he would take. He indicated that I should sit first. I took the chair. It seemed safer. I don't remember our introductions that day, who told whom a little bit about themselves first. I remember only that at a certain point in the meeting, he held up 2 fingers in the form of a peace sign. The diverging fingers were to illustrate 2 parts of the self, the conscious and the unconscious. These, of course, were not the words he used. Instead, he explained the concepts slowly, as though to a small child. There are parts of ourselves we know and parts of ourselves we don't know. The parts of ourselves we have repressed, Ben said, exert a great power over our lives. I held on tightly to the wooden arms of the chair. I had a sudden and overwhelming desire to go to sleep. My eyes blinked rapidly, involuntarily, as though trying to clear themselves of the form Ben's fingers had taken. I voiced several feeble protests, but I knew he was right, and I realized, known all along. He held up his 2 fingers again in a V to demonstrate the split, and with that peace sign, the world as I knew it fell apart. Or, more accurately, doubled. There was no longer one world, one truth I could count on, but 2, the known and the unknown, the acknowledged and the unacknowledged. The next week, when I arrived at Ben's office, the chair was gone. There was only the small couch, on which I saw immediately we would both have to sit. I accepted this with childlike resignation. It was clear to me how the rest of the therapy would go. The enforced collapsing of boundaries, the gentle but relentless nudging toward that which I had always, wisely, I realize now, denied. That we would be sitting so close together on the same couch, which was actually more like a love seat when I looked at it, was a physical manifestation of the emotional openness I was expected to bring. After this, anything could happen. For example, several sessions later, in the middle of our conversation, Ben took off a sweater to reveal a shirt buttoned at the neck but nowhere else. His hairy chest and belly protruded above his corduroys. I accepted this as though it was part of the process, drawing my knees in closer to my chest, but continuing dutifully with whatever childhood memory I had been dredging up. Toward the end of the meeting, he happened to look down and find his shirt undone. The color drained from his face. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. It was the first time I could discern the individual person behind the generalized listener. I couldn't rightly answer him, couldn't find a polite way to say that the whole exercise of revealing one's feelings seemed so bizarre to me, so freakish and uncomfortable, that the exposing of skin, the baring of the private body, seemed a logical consequence, in keeping with the proceedings. Ben did up his shirt, being careful not to miss a button. We went on talking. Several minutes later, though, he stopped and said again, "I'm so embarrassed. Why didn't you say anything?" And again, I was at a loss, shrugging and answering with some timid platitude that must have given him more information about me than the entire rest of the session, perhaps all our sessions combined. Here was a girl used to silence. Here was a girl who knew how to hide. Thank you very much.
The next writer this evening is Audrey Thomas, and I was thinking in the break about how amazing it is to have a night of rock stars and all of them be women, and thinking that a lot of that is due to really strong writing by some very important women several decades ago, and I would say Audrey Thomas is one of those writers who really forged path and made permissions that have allowed all the rest of the writers this evening to pursue their dreams and their voices. Audrey Thomas, when I knew she had a new novel, I got on board as quickly as possible and said, I really want her because I've been a fan of her writing for a long time. And she's here with a new novel called Local Customs. Please welcome Audrey Thomas.
delighted to be back in Winnipeg. The last time, the book I was presenting was much more Winnipeggy, since it was about an Orkney woman who worked for the Hudson Bay Company, disguised herself as a man, worked as John Fubitzer for 2.5 years, worked willingly and well, as it says in the chief factor's notebook, and was discovered to be a woman 20 minutes before her baby was born. But she was the only white woman who ever worked for the Hudson's Bay Company. They learned their lesson. Did they not? I'm going to just read a couple of things that have nothing particular to do with my book, but I found this in the Globe and Mail on the 18th, and I wonder how far we've really come. It's about a room. It's called the Man Cave. And this designer, this interior designer, has been hired to design this man cave. And here's the reason. This busy young Toronto family was expecting their 4th daughter when the wife asked me to create a quiet, manly escape for her husband, a place where he could relax and watch football. 4th daughter, he gets the man cave. So then the whole thing is the challenge that this designer had and how to make it perfect for him. And she didn't have much time because the baby was almost due. So I can't believe, I thought this was a joke at first, but I checked, it isn't. In the end, she said, the favorite aspect of her project, she did do it, each element of the design makes the whole room special. However, the blue tuxedo sofa, which is part of my plum furniture line, is so handsome it became the centerpiece. It is just the right length for a tall man to lie down on and watch a game. Last week in the Globe and Mail, how far have we come? What did that ad used to say? Don't call me baby. I haven't come a long way and don't call me baby, you know? You do wonder. The other thing is the Ghanaians, the people of Ghana, have a long tradition of sayings, proverbs, aphorisms, all kinds of things. And one of the ones I used to love so much, because it's full of irony, they also are very ironic about things. The hen, too, knows that it is dawn, but she leaves it to the cock to announce it. That was my favorite. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? I have a book, a huge book of sayings that I'd love to read them all to you instead of reading from my book. My book was huge when it started out. It's kind of the Nutri-System. I didn't bring the manuscript. You know how they do those awful before and after pictures? But it is very small now, and that's because I decided to take out and everything I thought wasn't important to me in terms of the book. So it ended up as a kind of play. There are several voices, and I will tell you right away who they are. The main character is Letitia Landon. She was a very well-known writer in the 1820s and 30s in Britain. Very, very well-known, very successful. She managed to put her brother through theological studies at Oxford. When her father died suddenly of a heart attack, because she was the eldest, she felt she had to provide for her widowed mother and a sickly younger sister. I mean, that's a lot of money. She said the money just came in and went out, not a lot for her. So she's the main character, and she begins the novel by saying, I can speak freely now that I am dead. So you already know that she said right at the beginning of the novel. So she's the main character. The second one is George MacLean. He's a Scot. The Scots were everywhere, as you know. Canada, one of the places. Africa, all over the place. So he's a Scot, and he's the governor of Cape Coast Castle on the Gold Coast, which is now part of Ghana. And Brodie Cruikshank, another Scot, who'd gone to school with George MacLean, and he oversees Elmina Castle, which is a few miles down the road. These castles still exist, by the way. The fourth person, who's fascinating, is Thomas Birch Freeman. He was the son of a freed slave and an Englishwoman, and he was sent to Cape Coast as a missionary by the Wesleyan Society. And he brought his bride, and there's another missionary couple. They all died within 2 days, except him. And he lived a very long life, and one of the reasons was he took the curtains that his dead wife had brought with her, and he turned them into a kind of net because he didn't like those mosquitoes attacking him. He knew that the actual connection between mosquitoes and malaria didn't take place till, I think, 1890 or something like that. But it was only because he was fussy, and so he lived to be in his 80s. Everybody else died off, from malaria, dysentery, various kinds of yellow fever. But he was very interesting because he was, as Letty says, he thinks he's one of us, and George says, well, he is. He was born in England. She said, yes, but he's so superior. He acts so superior to the natives. He calls them these benighted people. So he hates Letty, and she doesn't like him very much either. So they're all pushed together at Cape Coast Castle. And Letty, who thought she was going to be a spinster forever, a terrible thing to be, met George McLean. He asked her to marry him, and they sailed off to West Africa. He was on leave. So I'll just read you a couple of bits. This is Letty speaking. I was 34 when I first met George McLean, and somewhat fearful and uncertain as to what my future was to be. Famous, yes, but solitary. And I had recently noticed how some of my friends' children call me aunt. Some of those children would be having children, and then there would be another round of silver christening cups. Have you read Lamb's essays about poor relations? Would I end up like that? An embarrassment? An elderly lady living in a poky room at my brother's house, his wife treating me with condescension, his children prompted to ask Auntie if she wanted the last cake or crumpet, Auntie reclining even as her stomach rumbled. Is that what would happen to me? If my brother didn't want me, would I live out my declining years in a poky cottage, seeing no one, alone with my books, my canary, and a cat, until, if a traveler knocked, he would be greeted only by a whimper and a whisper behind a door? I had always declared I would never marry, but that is the sort of thing that women say, isn't it, when they are no longer girls and still single? I didn't so much want a husband. I wanted the security of a husband, the status that comes from being married. He would have to be a gentleman, of course. The Landons may have come down a bit in the world, but we are an old and respected family. It would also be useful if he had a good income, but even an adequate income would do. I had my own money from my books. And then here she meets George McLean at a dinner party, and she really goes after him in a kind of nice, modest way, but she knows she's going to get him. And finally, they're out walking in the park in Kensington Gardens, and he's telling her about Africa, and she says, and will there be lions and tigers, I asked. If you want those, you must go elsewhere, he said, smiling at my ignorance. But lovely birds, Letty, and palm trees, hibiscus flowers. The landscape is quite beautiful. I was rather hoping for lions and tigers, I said. But I smiled up at him so he would know I was only teasing, and I gave his arm a little squeeze. I don't think I have ever walked so much as I did in the days of our courtship. Kensington Gardens, Hyde Park Gardens, Regent's Park, Russell Square. Now, in my plan of paradise, I always said people will ride very little and walk not at all. In revenge, they shall have the most comfortable chairs from morning to night. But George was better outside. Drawing rooms and gossip did not interest him. He would have fled for London for the hills of Scotland long before, except for me. He smiled at babies in perambulators, at little boys sailing their boats. I did not want him to look at babies or little boys. It was important that he keep his mind on me and what he'd been working up to say. Oh, I'm feeling a little fatigued, I said, spotting an empty bench. Just beyond, an old man was casting bread to the ducks. We sat down. There was a not unpleasant silence between us. Cast thy bread upon the waters, I said, for thou shalt find it after many days. I've never been quite sure what that means. Still silence, but less comfortable. I wondered if I should suggest we continue our promenade. We were made a pretty picture. Captain McLean in his scarlet tunic, and I in my new pelisse. I made a small movement as if to rise, but he grabbed my hand. Letty, he said, I have no flowery way to say this. Will you marry me? Will you come back with me to the coast? Victory, bugles and pennants, but only in my head. Of course I will, George. And then, shall we walk? She married him. There was some trauma where he really wanted to get out of it, and that was quite strange. I mean, it wasn't strange, you understood. She was a city girl. She said if she ever got married, she didn't want to go farther than Hyde Park Corner. Why on earth would she want to go to Africa? Well, the reason she wanted to go to Africa, I think, was because it sounded so romantic, right? But she did. She married him. They sailed out to Cape Coast, and 8 weeks later she was dead. Not from malaria, not from dysentery, not from any of the 100 fevers, not from snakebite. People still don't know what she really died from, but she took these strange drops, which were prussic acid, but very diluted. You diluted it into distilled water, because prussic acid will kill you, as you probably know. You know, what is it? I don't know. I do it in the book, but I can't remember. It's 10 drops to kill a rabbit, 4 drops to kill a man, something like that. You know, they're used to kill rabbits and other things. It's a big poisoning thing. And when we were invited, my husband was invited to go to teach at a university in Ghana, and that's why we went out there. And I have an afterword about why we ended up there, and I'm just going to read you a tiny little bit of that. One Saturday Vancouver morning in 1964, back in the days when mail was still delivered on Saturdays, a blue aerogram was dropped through the mail slot in our front door. This act changed our lives. We were all sitting in the kitchen at the back of the house, enjoying our usual lazy Saturday full English breakfast: bacon, fried eggs, tomato mushrooms, and fried sourdough rye from Ernie's Austrian bakery, when we heard the mailman's steps on the porch. I'll get it, my husband said, and headed down the hall. He didn't return right away, and I began to wonder if there had been some bad news about his parents in England or mine in the States. When he did come back, he was holding an open air letter, and he had a funny smile on his face. How would you like to go to Africa? He said. Thank you.
The final writer this evening is a welcome back writer. Miriam Taves has this spring published her newest novel, All My Puny Sorrows. So several of us have already had a chance to read it, but we're always glad to have an occasion to offer her a warm welcome back. Please welcome Miriam Taves.
Hi, thank you. Thank you to Charlene, to the festival for having me here. It's great. It's great to be back in Winnipeg. The word is, I think, my mother and my daughter and I agreed, bittersweet. And and tonight, a huge emphasis on the sweet part of it. So thank you for coming out and listening. It's great to be a part of this roster of very talented writers. Amazing. And also I feel so, this just being in Winnipeg. I mean, really, I don't have the words actually to describe the feelings that I have being here. I've seen my daughter perform on this stage a million times, when she was growing up here. And Winnipeg is where I got my start as a writer, and was so nurtured and supported, except perhaps by the provincial welfare office, who when I went in with my kid, and I had to go and visit my worker time after time, and he would try and get me to think about employment, and I said, well, what I really want to do is stay at home and write, and he said, well, you expect the province to fund that? And I said, yeah, is that weird? Or, anyway. Uh, I'm going to read from this book. It's called Amps. It's called All My Puny Sorrows, but I call it Amps. And where am I? It is about two sisters. And one sister is very, very talented, brilliant, successful pianist, and happily married, and would very much like to die. And the other sister is younger, and her life is quite a mess. She's divorced with kids, trying to make ends meet, make money, and more than anything, keep her sister alive. And the book, it's about it's about life and death, but it's also about love, and it's about how we best love the people in our lives and what that means, what it means to love somebody. So I'll read. And in this case, what it means for the younger sister to love her older sister, which she does. So I'm going to read from chapter 2. Often I read from chapter 1, but now I'm going to read from chapter 2. I think I've only done this once before. I find it very difficult to actually move into the book myself. I know that I wrote it, but I can't really. It's just I'm just very, very gingerly and cautiously sort of moving forward into it myself. So I just stick to the periphery of the book and read from chapter 1 or chapter 2. Okay, so chapter 2, a little bit of chapter 2. Elfrida doesn't do interviews. One time she let me interview her for my cheesy class newspaper, but that's it. I was 11 and she was leaving home again, this time for good. She was on her way to Norway for a recital and to study with an old man she referred to as the Wizard of Oslo. She was 17. She'd finished high school early at Christmas. She'd got honors everything and 6 scholarships to study the piano and a prize from the Governor-General of Canada for highest marks, which sent the elders into paroxysms of rage and fear. One day at dinner, a few weeks before she was due to leave, Elf casually mentioned that while she was in Europe, she might as well go to Russia to explore her roots, and my father almost stopped breathing. "You will not," he said. "Yeah, I might," said Elf. "Why not?" My grandparents originally came from a tiny Mennonite village in Siberia in 1917, the year of the Bolshevik Revolution. Terrible things happened to them there in the land of blood. Any hint of the place, the slightest mention of anything Russian, and my parents would start clawing the air. Plautich was the language of shame. Mennonites had learned to remain silent, to shoulder their pain. My grandfather's parents were murdered in a field beside their barn, but their son, my father's father, survived by burying himself in a pile of manure. Then, a few days later, he was put in a cattle car and taken with thousands of other Mennonites to Moscow, and from there sent off to Canada. When Elf was born, he told my parents, "Don't teach your kids Plautdeutsch if you want them to survive." When my mother went to university to become a therapist, she learned that suffering, even though it may have happened a long time ago, is something that is passed from one generation to the next, like flexibility or grace or dyslexia. My grandfather had big green eyes, and dimly lit scenes of slaughter, blood on snow, played out behind them all the time, even when he smiled. "Absurdities and lies, Yoli," said my mother. "The worst thing you can do in life is be a bully." My interview happened in the car on the way to the airport in Winnipeg. As usual, our parents were in the front seat, my dad was driving, and Elf and I were in the back. "You're never coming back, are you?" I whispered to her. She told me that was the stupidest thing she'd ever heard. We looked at fields and snow. She was wearing her white leather choker with a blue bead and an army jacket. We were driving over black ice. "Is that your question for the interview?" she asked me. "Yeah," I said. "Yoli," she said, "you should have prepared other questions." "Okay," I said, "what's so hot about playing the piano?" She told me that the most important thing was to establish the tenderness right off the bat, or at least close to the top of the piece. Just a hint of it, a whisper, but a deep whisper, because the tension will mount. The excitement and the drama will build. I was writing it down as fast as I could. And when the action rises, the audience might remember the earlier moment of tenderness. And remembering will make them long to return to infancy, to safety, to pure love. Then you might move away from that, put the violence and agony of life into every note, building still until there's an important decision to make. Return to tenderness, even briefly, glancingly, or continue on with the truth, the violence, the pain, the tragedy, to the very end. "Okay," I said, "that should do it." "Well, thanks for sort of answering my question, weirdo." Both choices are valid, she said. It depends where you want to leave your audience. Happy and content, innocent again, like babies, or wild and restless and yearning for something they've barely known. Both are good. Got it, thanks, I said. Who's going to be your page turner now? Some Norwegian? She took a book out of her army backpack. She was into military-issued everything like Patty Hearst and Che Guevara, and chucked it into my lap. When you're finished with that horse series, she said, your real life starts here. She tapped the book with her finger. She was referring to my obsession with the black stallion. Also, I had recently started horseback riding lessons with my friend Julie and was on my way to becoming third best barrel racer in the provincial under-13 category, which contained only 3 members. In a way, I'm relieved that you're going to Oslo, I said. It was either that or hitch barefoot to the west coast, she said. The roads are icy, said my father. See that semi in the ditch? He wanted to change the subject. Elf's hitchhiking plan was a crazy idea he had buried. My mother had laughed and said, hitchhiking barefoot to the west coast is a reasonable idea, maybe, but not in January. She didn't believe in burying anything. What is this? I was looking at the book Elf had given me. Oh my God, Yolandi, she said. When you see the words collected poems on the cover of a book, what do you think is inside the book? Can you drive any faster? I asked my father. We don't want her to miss her plane. I was trying to act tough, but I truly believed that I might die from heartbreak when my sister went away, to the extent that I had written a secret will, bequeathing my skateboard to Julie and my lifeless body to Elf, which I hoped would make her feel really guilty for leaving me to die alone. I had nothing else but my skateboard and my body to give to people, but I attached a note of gratitude to my parents and a drawing of a motorcycle with the New Hampshire state motto, live free or die. And by the way, I said, I'm not reading those horse books anymore. What are you reading then? My sister asked. Adorno, I said. She laughed. Oh, because you saw that I'm reading him? She asked. Don't say reading him, I said. You think you're so big. Yoli, said Elf, don't say you think you're so big. That's what everyone around here says when somebody purports to know about something. I could say tomorrow is Thursday, and you'd say, oh, you think you're so big. Don't say it anymore. It's déclassé. Our mother said, Elf, come on, enough advice on how to live like a dilettante. You'll be gone soon. We should be using this precious time to have fun. Elf sank back and explained that she was just trying to help me survive the world outside our hamlet. And also, she added, dilettante is the exact wrong word for you to have used in this situation. Okay, Elf, said my mum, but let's just speak English or sing or something like that. She'd had 15 brothers and sisters, so she knew about keeping the peace. Our father suggested we play I Spy. Oh, my God, Elf whispered into my ear. Are we 6? Don't ever tell them I've had 3 different types of sex already, okay? What do you mean, 3? Elf told me that after the poet Shelley drowned, his body was cremated right there on the beach, but his heart didn't burn, so his wife Mary kept it in a small silk bag in her desk. I asked her if it wouldn't have rotted and begun to smell, but she said no, it had calcified, like a skull, and that really it was only the remains of his heart. I told her that I would do that for her too, keep her heart with me in my desk, or in my gym bag, or my pencil case, somewhere very safe, and she hugged me and laughed and told me I was sweet, but that really it was a romantic thing for lovers to do. Before she disappeared behind the frosted glass doors of airport security, Elf and I had played one last game of concentration, and in the midst of all that leg slapping and hand clapping, she said, Swivelhead. That was her nickname for me because I was very often looking around for solid cues to what was going on and never finding them. You better write me letters. I said, yeah, I will, but they'll be boring. Nothing happens in my life. Nothing has to happen, she said, for it to be life. Well, I'll try. No, Yoli, said Elf, better than that. She yanked on my arms. Please, you have to. I'm counting on you. They were calling her flight, and she released her grip. She was pulling away from me. Our parents stood stricken but acting brave, smiling big and dabbing at their eyes with tissues. So I said, I will, okay? Take a chill pill. All right, said Elf. I'm out of here. Also, don't say chill pill. Adieu, arrivederci. I know she was crying, but she turned her head away at the very last second so I wouldn't notice, and I thought I should include that in a letter to her under observations of things meant to be hidden. On the way home from the airport, my mother drove and my father lay in the back seat with his eyes closed. I sat next to my mother in the front. It was snowing. We couldn't see anything except snowflakes in the headlights and a tiny bit of the road ahead. I thought the snowflakes looked like notes and signatures falling and swirling over the little stave of road we could see in front of us, one measure of music. My mother told me she would tap the brakes slightly to see if it was still icy, and before I could stop her, we had spun out of control and landed upside down in the ditch. Thank you very much.